a relatively advanced species, humans, on a planet full of life. And when we look out around us in the universe, it all looks dead. We still face obstacles and things that could prevent us from becoming Grabby. But humanity is not planned. We have been random, basically. That's scary.
Hey everybody, Dr. Z here. Welcome to our podcast. We have the pleasure of talking here with Dr. Robin Hanson. And thank you so much for being here. I appreciate it.
I look forward. What shall we talk about?
You want to start a little bit about telling us a little bit about your background?
I am an economics professor, but I'm tenured, and that lets me do whatever I want, so I haven't stayed in my lane. Before I became an economics professor, I started out as an engineering student as an undergraduate. I switched to physics, then I went to grad school and did philosophy of science for a bit, switched back to physics, then went off to Silicon Valley and did AI research for 9 years, although on the side I was working with people on hypertext publishing. That long period, I decided to go back to school to get my PhD in social science at Caltech, which was first political science and then became more economics, because that's where I got my degree. I had a postdoc in health policy. I did my economics research to get tenure. I was most famous for prediction markets, although I did a lot of other economic theory. And then post-tenure, I started writing a lot on my blog. I have a book called The Age of M, Work, Love, and Life, When Robots Rule the Earth. And then another book called The Elephant in the Brain, Hidden Motives in Everyday Life, co-authored with Kevin Simler. And since then, I've done work on a variety of topics, including Grabby Aliens, alternative institutions, the sacred, and lately, fertility and cultural drift.
That is awesome. I can go into each one of those. So fascinating work. Maybe we can start in the large scale with the Grabby Aliens. I know it's a technical term that you did in a paper. Would you mind explaining that concept of Grabby Aliens?
Sure.
And one of the things that when I watched your video, and maybe I can show it in a little bit if you want me to. In that simulation, there's a moment in time when the first circle appears, the birth of that first circle in the black. Right. I'm interested into right before that. What happens right before that?
We are right now a relatively advanced species, humans, on a planet full of life. And when we look out around us in the universe, it all looks dead. But when we look forward into our future, we at least think we see the hope that we could become much more advanced and then no longer be limited to this planet. And in fact, go out into the universe and not just visit, but change it. That's the future we think we see for ourselves. And if we change the universe when we go out into it, it might look different from far away. Then we ask, well, if this is what we might do, could we see out there in the universe other versions of what we might become? And this is what a Grabby Alien is. Grabby Alien is just something like what we might become if we left here and we went out into the universe and we changed things and we just kept going and never stopped until we met somebody else who would stop us. That's what a Grabby Alien. So the idea is we're looking for other things like ourselves out there, something that would have started very simple, very early on in the universe, advanced through stages of life to become at a level comparable to us, and then further, and then it would start growing away from its original planet, and it might grow very fast, and whatever it was doing, it would make things look different. So that if we looked out into the universe, we might see them by just looking for a sphere of something that was just different. A growing sphere that was different would plausibly be the sign of an alien civilization that was beyond our level and growing. So the question is, well, are there any? And if we can't see any, what does that say about the distribution of species like ourselves in the universe? There is this simple observation that we don't see anything obvious. So one possibility then is there's absolutely nothing out there, nothing whatsoever, as far as you could go. We're the only things anywhere at all, which means when we finally start growing, we can just keep growing for a very long time because nothing will ever get in our way. That's one possibility, but you might wonder, well, maybe there's other things out there that are too small now to see or too far away to see. What is, in fact, the distribution of Grabby aliens in all of space-time? That's a key question that you might want to know. what we did is we made a mathematical model of Grabby aliens in space-time with 3 key parameters, and we found a way to estimate each of those parameters from data we have, which then means, okay, we roughly have the model of where aliens are in space-time.
What are the criteria of the models? What are the specific measurements of the models?
So it's a stochastic model, i.e. it's random. And so the
Uh-huh.
idea is that the prototype or the early life beginnings of an alien civilization appears at random places in space. Now, not exactly, doesn't just appear in random empty spots in space. It's going to appear at a random, say, planet or star system. But, on the largest scales, those are relatively evenly spread. So it appears at a random place in space. Okay. Then it also appears at a random point in time, except it's not uniform across time. It goes according to a power law that comes from something called a hard steps model that I can explain in a minute if you want.
Mhm.
And then there's the third parameter, which is once it appears in time at a place in space, it starts to expand. And then there's just the speed of expansion. How fast does it expand? And that's the only 3 parameters of the model. There's 2 parameters of where it appears in time. There's a power and a constant of a power law. And there's this third parameter of how fast it expands. So it appears at random places, random times, and then expands. And then different places appear,
That's interesting.
different
I'm
ones
going to
appear
show
at
a
different
picture
times
here
and
for the
places. And
listeners.
as they expand, eventually they meet. From that point on, the universe is full of those aliens. And I don't really care which ones fill it after that point. The main point is the universe is empty to start with. And then there are these things that appear and they expand and eventually they fill everything. And that's the key behavior of the model. And it's a very simple model. And the point is to tell you that not only is it a plausible model, it only has 3 parameters and we can get each of the parameters from data.
This is the space and time right here, right? And then these are the circles that are already running into each other.
Right. So this diagram you're looking at is a space-time diagram. So going down into the diagram is time. So you see some cones, and at the tip of each cone is the point in time and space where that thing appeared, and then going downward is time going forward. And so the things are cones because they're expanding in space according to time.
And then right here in this one,
Right. That's a 3-dimensional, video simulation showing that there's a volume of space and that the volume starts out empty, and then soon some spheres start appearing, they grow until they merge, and then until the entire volume is full. And they're all growing at the same speed, and they're appearing at random positions, and they're appearing in time according to this power law. So at the very beginning, hardly anything appears, and they appear only very slowly at first, but towards the end, they appear very rapidly. So nothing has appeared that's visible from a long distance, but the idea would be life appears earlier and then slowly develops and advances, largely invisible from a long distance. And then at some point, it reaches a level beyond our level where it can expand. And then once it expands, it just keeps expanding at the same maximum feasible rate. They've reached some maximal technology by the time we see them, because the rate at which they expand never changes. It's just always the same speed.
I was thinking almost like when there is a birth, you see the baby come out, but it's been already brewing,
Right.
It's been brewing genetically and then physiologically, and then when you see it. But one of the things that was interesting and that I kind of wanted to hear your thoughts on it is, okay, so if it's too fast, if it's too slow, then we would see it. Yeah,
The speed of expansion is one of the 3 parameters. And when I tell you we can get each of the parameters from data, that parameter comes from the datum that when we look up in the sky, we see nothing. If that speed were slow, it turns out that when we looked up at the sky at a random period when things appear, we would see lots of things in the sky. And the only scenario where we wouldn't see much in the sky would be when the expansion is very fast. So that's why we can estimate the expansion must be very fast. Now, it's obviously logically possible that we are the very first one, and therefore that's why we don't see anything else. We're the very first, but that's pretty unlikely. More likely, we're in the middle of the distribution. Roughly half of them have appeared before us, half will appear after us. And the reason we can't see them is they're expanding so fast. by the time you can see them, they're almost here, is the idea.
And then that time, to kind of put that time into perspective, like in terms of seeing them, what does that look like in a real time? Like, let's say that they were really fast and that they are getting here, and now we're seeing them, because if they're traveling at the speed of light, that means that, like, but so like, does that mean like that, like if you were sitting in a telescope, you could then start seeing it slowly as you're drinking a cup of coffee? Like, what's the time comparison, you know?
Well, if they're going at half the speed of light, then you'll see them when they're halfway here, is the first time you'll see them. You would almost always see things very large in the sky. If they were at all close, they would be very large in the sky. They wouldn't be tiny little thing. You wouldn't need a telescope. They'd be much larger than the full moon. And that's and that they still might be millions of years away from getting here, even when they filled half the sky. So we clearly are not nearly here. Again, it would just take a really long time to get here from very far away. So the key parameters of our model that we estimate from this data is that Grabby aliens appear roughly once per million galaxies, which is very rare. And then they expand at roughly half the speed of light. If we were to sort of go out expanding, when we would meet them is roughly 1 billion years. So this isn't soon, not remotely soon.
One per billion.
1 per million galaxies.
1 per million galaxies. Jeez, I mean.
So that's rare, but the universe has, trillions of galaxies. So there's definitely a lot of them in the universe, even the observable universe, there's definitely a lot of them out there, but they're still really far from here. So the chance that there's another one in our galaxy is really small, at least according to the simple model. We can extend the model if you like later, but the simple model just says they're really far away. So if you're trying to look out in a telescope to see a tiny thing, there's not much chance of seeing a tiny thing. Either you're going to see an enormous thing or nothing at all.
Yeah, because it's coming fast. I mean, at you, and
right.
I mean, in the mathematics of the circles, they just kind of run into each other, or what happens at that point?
Once these spheres merge or touch, then our model isn't making a prediction about what happens then.
Got it.
The prediction is just, look, we don't know if there's a fight or who wins the fight. We just know somebody wins the fight. That is, something is still there. That part of the universe is full of advanced aliens, and therefore still looks different from far away.
And looking at the macro, now that we've taken a look at that, what sort of practical lessons did you take away from this work?
Well, 2 kinds of lessons. The most straightforward is people have always wanted a cosmology that puts themselves in the context of the biggest things there are. People have always wanted to know, where do I sit compared to everything? And through most of history, those cosmologies included active agents, gods, if you will, aliens, something out there, like big things out there doing things. That was part of the usual cosmological story. And in the last century, say, our standard scientific view of the universe, the story it tells about where we sit in everything is that everything is dead but us. That's the usual story of the universe. And it's less exciting or engaging as a story because it doesn't have any agents. There's just this dead universe, and we show up, and then, well, we might go away or we might not, and the universe continues being dead. Now, the first correction to that theory has to be, well, if we don't die, then the future universe doesn't look dead, because we're going to go out and change it. And that's sort of a basic futurist perspective, is that, you've got, astronomers predicting how stars and galaxies will look billions of years from now. And the futurist says, no, they won't. If we're still around, we're going to go change them. And they won't look anything like they look now, or they won't look anything like your model suggests, because your models are based on everything staying dead. That's at least a little more motivating a model, although it's still not that exciting a story. Here it is, us, we show up and we can do whatever we want. Everything else is dead. This Grabby Aliens model is a little more interesting as a cosmology, as a story of everything there is and how we compare to it. The story is, we might become Grabby Aliens, or we might not. But whether or not we do, there are others who did and will out there. That changes the story. And now the story is, do we want to join them? Dare we? Can we? Will we join them? because we might not. We might destroy ourselves or decide to just stay limited to a small local area, in which case we won't stay isolated forever, even if we don't die, because they will come here eventually, say 2 billion years. And then if a Grabby alien civilization comes here while we're still small, they will decide what happens. We would not be able to resist their choices. So either we appear now and go away, or we appear now and stay small until something else comes and rules us, or we decide to join them and become Grabby aliens ourselves by expanding into the universe. Then we ask, well, if this is what we might do, could we see out there in the universe other versions of what we might become? And this is what a Grabby alien is. Grabby alien is just something like what we might become if we left here. And if we do, then we will eventually meet them, our peers. They will be, by the time we meet them, at a similar advanced level than us, but they will have made different choices than us. And then not too long after meeting them, we would meet many others and then hear stories of even further others farther away. There will be this period in the future, if we can become a peer of the Grabby aliens, one of them, then there will be this period where they each look at the others and say, what do they have that we respect? And all these Grabby alien civilizations will be asking this question, what do they have that I respect? And of course, what do I have that they might respect? They would all be seeking to earn the respect of the others. And we might aspire to at least have some things that others respect enough to copy, to take on. And that's a vision of our place in the universe that's perhaps a little more motivating, more of an interesting story than the story that everything is dead or everything's dead except us and we have complete freedom about what to do.
And the scale is interesting because in the macro scale, I mean, if we look at the big scale, that big scale, but it's almost like the lesson is the same while we're going through our lives here on Earth as competition, is kind of when they meet, then it's almost about competition. And then the other thought that I had was, is this one of the, if we talk about, you talk about in some of your work about the hard steps that civilizations has to go through to achieve a certain place. Then in the Grabby alien theory, is that one of the hard steps to meet and collaborate and with another Grabby alien civilization, or would that be one hard step?
You're certainly right that we have competition in our world today, and many people have wondered how particular that is to our world as opposed to general in the universe. So this Grabby aliens perspective suggests that competition is more fundamental, a feature of the universe, not just a happenstance of 21st century capitalism or something. It's a deep feature of the universe. Now, I told you there were these 3 parameters in the model. One was the speed of expansion. The other were 2 parameters of the power law. That power law comes from this hard steps model. The idea is that life had to go through a sequence of steps on a planet like Earth, and there was a deadline. It had to go through all the steps before life on that planet runs out. So life on our planet will run out in roughly another billion years because the sun will slowly get hotter and then it will get too hot on Earth for life like ours to survive. So there's a deadline and life has to go through a whole bunch of hard steps by the end of that deadline. The idea of them being hard is the chance of any one random planet, even if it starts the first step of some life, the chance it will go through all the steps to get to where we are by the deadline is really small. Almost all planets don't make the deadline. They go through some steps, but then time runs out. And
this is because of the mathematical model of the planets.
It's not just the model, it's the model of the hard steps. So, first we had to have life at all, then we had to have sex, for example, we had to have photosynthesis, we had to then have eukaryotes so that we could have multicellular animals. Life had to innovate a number of different ways. And plausibly, each of those innovations was just crazy hard. Basically, there had to be this huge soup of all these different pieces of life bouncing around and trying things out at random until every once in a very rare while, it makes the right combination that works. and that makes the next step possible. So the idea is that these steps are crazy hard. And then we have a mathematical model of crazy hard saying what happens when you have to get a bunch of crazy hard steps before a deadline. So a metaphor might be, say you've got one of these, terrorist shows, there's a bomb, it'll go off at midnight, and there's a bunch of locks. And if you can pick all the locks, you can, turn off the bomb. So, but what if each of the locks was just really hard? So hard that by randomly trying to pick that lock, you probably won't even succeed until before midnight. And what if there's 5 locks, all of which need to be picked before midnight? Well, most likely you just won't succeed by midnight. If there's millions of these bombs, maybe you would never succeed on any of them by midnight. But that's what life is like. There's this huge universe of all these different planets. Each step is really hard on any one planet. Still, out of billions and trillions of planets, the idea is eventually some planet will get lucky enough to get all these steps done before the deadline. And so that's the idea that the very basic parts of life could be very ubiquitous in the universe, but still life at our level could be really rare, i.e. once per million galaxies rare. So now we can actually tell roughly how many steps there must have been by the time stamps on Earth's history. So when you have a bunch of steps, all of which are really hard to get done by some deadline, it turns out that even if the steps are very different in difficulty, some are much easier than others, still, if you succeed by a deadline, it turns out that the time duration between succeeding at the steps is drawn from the same distribution. Not only that, the time distribution left over at the end, before the deadline, that's also drawn from the same distribution. So we can look at when things happened on Earth to get a rough guess of how many steps there were. The first key duration that matters is when did life first appear in the fossil record after when life was first possible? And that seems to be roughly 400 million years. And then the other duration is how much time is left over between now, when we finally succeeded, the time when the deadline runs out, which is roughly 1.1 billion years. So those are 2 samples supposedly from the same distribution. And from that, you can estimate that there's roughly 6 hard steps in Earth's history. Life on Earth had to go through roughly 6 steps, maybe 3, maybe 12, but roughly 6 hard steps to get to where we are. You could ask, well, what if, the planet had just a little bit longer duration to go? How much does that increase the chance that you'd succeed at all these steps? And it turns out that goes as the power of the number of steps, i.e. time to the 6th power, if there's 6 steps. So if you imagine all these planets out there, all trying to go through all these hard steps, trying to get to the end, you can see that some of them will succeed, and the rate at which they succeed will be roughly a power law, the 6th power, if there's 6 hard steps, all through the universe. And that's why there's this power law in this model I showed you, where at the beginning, there hardly anything happens, and then a few things start to happen, and they happen faster and faster and faster. That's the power of 6 power law turning on. So the power law comes from the number of hard steps. And so that's why there's these 2 parameters, one of which is the power and the other is the constant. And that power comes from this history of life on Earth saying roughly 6 steps. If each step on average took, 500 million to 1 billion years, it doesn't look like it'll take us now another 500 million years to become Grabby. Looks like that could happen in as little as 1,000 or even less. Whatever difficulties there are from here on, they aren't of that same mathematical form where it just takes forever of trying to eventually get to something. We could face obstacles of the form, you try something, and if you don't succeed, you just fail forever. You never get a second chance. We could face those sort of obstacles, but we won't be facing what I call a try step of the sorts that we've seen so far, of these 6 so far, where basically life just had to keep trying and trying and trying and trying and trying until it finally figures something out. That's not the kind of difficult steps we face now, because there's just no way it's going to take another 500 million years to get Grabby.
Because of the log, because you're just accelerating the progress.
Our change is so very fast that it's, basically, if we were kept growing at our current rate, we would fill the universe in less than 10,000 years. So there's no way we can keep growing at this current rate, even for 10,000 years. So clearly, either we'll get very big very fast, or growth rates will really slow down. But it's kind of crazy to imagine they could slow down so much that it would take 500 million years to get to the next step. So we're pretty sure that we've gone through all the try steps. that we need. And if there's more steps that we have to get through, they are try once steps. You try once, and if you don't succeed, you just fail, and you're just done.
Like we're talking like nuclear.
Right. Something that made us extinct would be a try
Thinking.
once step.
So this is interesting. Do you think that in those hard steps, so now that we're here, the technology that we have arriving now is one of those factors that accelerates and actually stops the try from being necessary and more. You have so much technology, so much efficiency, so much productivity that what you are trying is a lot faster and a lot more accurate.
We have a lot of technology, so we're innovating and growing very rapidly on a cosmological timescale, but we still face obstacles and things that could prevent us from becoming Grabby. We aren't guaranteed to be Grabby yet. So
Right.
it's worth thinking about what could stop us. And of course, there are other things that might not stop us, but they might slow us down for a while. So we do face obstacles. Interestingly, is just that we might choose not to get Grabby. We might have some sort of world government that likes us all being together and able to cooperate together and doesn't like the competitive scenario that result from becoming Grabby. So if we become Grabby, then our descendants spread out in all different directions very rapidly. And then it'll be very hard for them to coordinate, certainly by having a government or say at the threat of the use of power, because somebody heading off in one direction at half the speed of light just really can't do much to somebody heading off the opposite direction at half the speed of light. They just can't have much of an effect. At that rate of expansion, this civilization is going to be fragmented in terms of control. Each part of it can be pretty autonomous and therefore can compete with the other parts. And then they can change to become strange. So once we become Grabby, we know that our descendants will become strange and compete, not just with each other, but with us. That is, if we here at the center of the civilization decide to stay here and let other people go out there, we know that after a while, their descendants can come back here and take over. You might imagine the powers that control the solar system before anybody leaves would say, we don't want anybody to leave. We like the fact that we are a cooperating civilization here we have rules and we can enforce those rules on everybody who's here in the solar system. And they don't like the idea that once they let anybody leave, that era is over. You then have a permanent era of competition and divergence, which people might not like. So one risk of not becoming Grabby is because we choose not to become Grabby. We say we like being here together, sharing a civilization, being able to make and share rules, and not competing and not allowing any of us to become arbitrarily strange.
It almost seems like we're in the process of making those decisions already. I mean, SpaceX.
People do discuss these issues. We're still a ways away. So the issue isn't when we get off of Earth. The issue is when we leave the solar system. Our solar system is small enough that you could have a civilization in the solar system that was coherent, and if anybody deviated from central rules, they just get squashed. So in the solar system, you can see everything, and you could throw a rock at anything and smash it if you don't like what it's doing. So in the solar system, we can maintain governance, maintain a coherent society with rules. But when you leave the solar system off for other stars, that's when it gets beyond central control.
That's interesting, because that kind of makes me think of your work, Cultural Drift, a little bit, because it's like you can keep control of a culture in a company for so far as it's getting big. And then once it gets really big, most companies have so many different employees that like they don't even know what the other one is doing, and they're kind of doing their own thing, and you start losing that glue of a culture unless the company works really hard at it.
So it is hard to manage larger companies compared to small ones and to keep them coherent. But at the scale of the world, centuries ago, the world was just many fragmented cultures. And now we do have more of a world culture, especially among elites. We have people who mainly identify as part of this elite world culture, and they don't identify so much with their nature of their nation of origin. That's been created because we can travel and communicate so much more easier around the world. And so we have merged in many ways into a world culture that has many advantages in the sense that, an integrated economy allows trade across a wider range. We can communicate with each other more easily, sharing languages, sharing many mental habits and cultural styles. So a lot of technological change has been accelerated by this merging into a world culture. Many people like that idea. And so there's ways in which regulation is pretty harmonized around the world. So look at COVID. Basically, at the beginning of COVID, world elites got together and discussed what to do, came up with an agreement that basically the whole world did. And we have world agreement on things like nuclear power, airline regulations, organ sales, a whole wide range of things where basically the entire world does it the same way. And people will continue to have a world like that for a while. And they may like that. And that's why they might choose to prevent expansion into the universe. Once you allow expansion, you no longer have this world that all agrees on what to do and keeps the peace that way. So we have much less war in the world than we did a century or two ago. And that's in part because of this integrated world culture. Peace is a consequence as well. So there are, a lot of things people like about this integrated world culture. It was made possible by, ease of travel and communication, and of course, wealth. We're rich compared to our ancestors. And then we can afford to be more peaceful and carefree, if you will, because we're less anxious to grab what the next guy has. Competition is less fierce, certainly, in a world of wealth and ease. This all sounds great. And then there's a big problem that I think most people haven't noticed. This has turned off, in many ways, a powerful engine of cultural evolution. Culture is humanity's superpower. This is what's made humans better than all the other animals. It's the fact that we can share things via culture and learn via culture. Instead of having to reinvent things ourselves and embody them in our DNA, we can embody insights and tools in culture. And cultural evolution is promoted in part by having this large integrated world, in the sense that any innovation found anywhere in the world can now spread to the entire rest of the world. But there are some features that cultures share across the culture. And for that, you need different cultures to compete. So for example, different cultures have different norms about marriage and parenting and work and nation and neighborhood and nature and death. These norms are often shared in a culture. And then it's hard for an individual in that culture to deviate from those norms. And, that's for good reason, in the sense that often norms help promote cooperation. If we all agree about something and make sure everybody does it the same way, we can prevent various kinds of malfeasance. Cultures tend to produce norms that get people to behave in similar ways they're all supposed to behave to keep the peace. And when things can vary within a culture, those things a larger culture does better at. But when you have fewer larger cultures, you get less innovation and evolution of the features that cultures share. And so that's the cost. That's the problem with our new modern world of a world culture, is we have a lot less variety, these features that cultures share, and a lot less competition among them, a lot weaker selection pressures. So until a few hundred years ago, the entire world was full of hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures who were mostly independent from each other. They had to, pay tribute to whatever empire was nearby, but they mostly were self-sufficient, and they could even ignore mostly their neighbors and what norms, et cetera, they had. But those hundreds of thousands of little peasant cultures were poor, near the edge of survival, and they could be knocked out by famine, pandemic, wars. They could just be killed because they were at the edge of survival. When one of those little peasant cultures got weird in some way, if that weirdness was not adaptive, i.e. promoting its survival, that peasant culture would just go away. There was selection. And so the world of peasant cultures we had was the result of many centuries and thousands of years of selection, or the kinds of local cultures that would best survive all these threats. And that was the world of cultures we inherited as of a few hundred years ago. But then in the last few hundred years, first we made nations out of peasants. We formed national cultures, which repressed and merged the many local peasant cultures. And then we formed a world culture, especially among elites. So we have much less variety, and we also have much less selection in that there's just, we're healthy, we're rich, we don't die of starvation, we don't die of disease, we don't die of war. And each culture can go pretty weird and still survive. And because that selection pressure is way down, we just have a lot more sort of random drift in culture. Now, each culture can't drift independently because it's merged into a world culture, but world culture is drifting without the discipline of selection.
When you're saying drifting, you're meaning the degradation of specific factors, or just pivoting into different values, different operational models, or what do you mean when you say drifting?
So, like I said, the features of cultures that can't change within a culture include norms, say, a norm against murder, norm to take care of your parents, and status markers, what we count as high status, prestigious, what we therefore want to emulate. Norms and status markers, change a culture and they change behavior in a culture. And then it was selection pressures that made those functional, that made those adaptive. And we've taken away those selection pressures. And so now our norms and status markers have been changing, and they aren't changing because of selection. They're changing because of other processes that aren't adaptive. So an example is fertility. Fertility has been falling for a while, and it's falling rapidly lately. And the main causes of fertility fall are changes in culture. So, for example, we have intensive parenting norms, more gender equality, more expectation of more years of schooling. Schooling counts more for status. We have less grandparent involvement. We have more urbanity, less religion. We have a whole bunch of cultural trends that are contributing toward lower fertility.
And also some biological factors that we don't know why. I mean, biological factors that might be impacted by cultural factors like endocrine disruptors. And
it looks like most of the cause is cultural, but there could be some other causes too.
Yeah, because I mean, even Quest laboratories or LabCorp, they actually decrease the threshold of what testosterone levels for men, the normal range is, because they've been dropping. So there's also, to tie with that, there's a biological decline of.
It seems pretty clear that if people wanted to have a lot more kids, they could. There's a huge element of people choosing not to have more kids.
Yeah, my grandma had 21 kids. Yeah. So, I mean, you don't see that anymore.
Right. So culture has changed in big, important ways to cause lower fertility. And from a biological point of view, that's maladaptive. That wouldn't happen in the past because selection pressures would stop it. So many centuries ago, if some local village, some local group of peasants happened to decide to have lower fertility, they would shrink relative to their neighbors, and that habit would decline as a fraction of the world. So up until a few centuries ago, when culture changed to make things less adaptive, selection fixed it. And that's just not happening now. We are drifting in cultural terms without selection disciplining those changes. It's not necessarily a random walk of changes. We have some theories about why there would be certain tendencies to change in certain directions. Fundamentally, that matters less than the fact that it wouldn't be changing to this degree if selection were ruling.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is there anything in mathematics that speaks to the underlying mechanisms of this cycle?
The key mechanism we just went over is that we got rich.
Yeah.
And getting rich seems to have made us peaceful. And being rich lets us not starve to death and be better at resisting disease. So we have just been able to prevent selection. And of course, another factor is just that our reproductive systems haven't improved much. That is, we grow new humans slowly, and that rate at which we grow up, make humans and grow them up, hasn't really sped up with all our other technology speeding up. So that meant that we could just grow in wealth per person because we can grow the economy faster than we can grow the number of people.
Yeah, because the improvements are marginal in terms of fertility, the fertility technology, and then mortality at birth. That has improved drastically, but is not the same as having 20 kids.
Right.
I mean, it's only marginal.
Right. So obviously, if getting rich allowed us to much more rapidly make kids, we would have grown by growing the population. And that's what we did do until a few centuries ago. So, for the last 10,000 years, the world economy, say, doubled roughly every 1,000 years. When it doubled, what it mostly did is double the number of people. because it could. Human population can double in 1,000 years pretty easily. And so we didn't get rich per person as we doubled every 1,000 years. We got rich by basically having more people. It's only in the last few centuries when we've been able to grow the economy faster than we can grow people. And that's why the wealth or income per person has been increasing. So this has only been a problem in the last few centuries, not before then, because of that. And so now we face this problem of cultural drift, of our culture drifting into maladaptation, into dysfunction, slowly, but still increasingly. Fertility is our best sign of that. It shows that we do have a pretty integrated world culture. This integrated world culture is changing fast, and those changes aren't mainly driven by selection.
That's interesting, because if you were looking at this as a game, if we were going to create a video game that was the world, the earth, why would you put this lesson in there for society to grow through it? Why would you decrease fertility? You know, what sort of evolutionary benefits would come out of a society working itself through this?
Right. I mean, look, we're very tempted to imagine stories where there's some power behind the scenes who makes the story to teach us a lesson. And there just is no such power here. We are just randomly drifting in the space of possibilities. That's the most stark fact to know about humanity and the universe, is there is no power behind the scenes trying to make it a good story. There is no point to it. There is no purpose. Things just happen when they can happen. We got rich, and so we broke the cultural engine that had been shaping us and disciplining us. And so we're slowly breaking, and that won't stop until something fixes it. So we could talk about what are the potential fixes, but the problem didn't appear, as most problems don't appear, because someone's trying to teach us a lesson with them. And they, so in school, when you get problems, they are problems at the level that you can handle, and they are there to help teach you lessons about, new things to learn that are at your level that you can just barely manage to do the problems and then learn how to do the next set of problems, right? In school, the problems you're given are there to teach you. And so you basically know they can be done, even if they're hard, and they can be done with the tools you just learned. At least some of you can do them. That's a thing you know about problems in school. In stories, characters face obstacles that the author has set up in order to have their character develop and learn things from. But the universe is not doing that for us. If we face a problem, we may learn lessons from it, but it's not there to teach us something, and it could just kill us.
Yeah, that's interesting, because that's what happens in nature. It's unapologetic.
Nature's not trying to teach you lessons. The lessons are there to be learned, but you might prefer to figure them out and avoid the problems, because often if you don't, you just die.
Yeah, that's one way to look at it. That's interesting. And so then you don't think about purpose behind, or maybe you do in a different way behind. So for instance, like the hard steps, right? Like 3 to 12 or 6.
Right.
Why would you put urgency behind, okay, you have this amount of time to figure this out? And oftentimes what that does is it enhances innovation. It enhances your focus, your attention, to say, okay, I have to get this done by tomorrow. And oftentimes great work comes out of that,
Right.
You figure things out. And so whether it's, whatever it is, the model that we're working with, sometimes I guess to me is useful to think about it in a way that that the purpose is to figure out the clues and the problems and the issues, so that you are adding some sort of progress to that evolution.
It's good to motivate yourself by having plans.
Right.
Okay. And even to plan to learn things that will be useful for future obstacles. But humanity as a whole has not been in the habit of planning itself. Maybe we will someday, but so far we haven't. Individuals in their lives plan, even companies plan, sometimes nations plan in a war, say. And when you're planning, you need to decide what your purpose is, figure out the obstacles, and see sort of how far into the future you can foresee things in order to lay out plans that far. But humanity is not planned. We have been random, basically. That's scary. It means that there's sort of not much assurance that we are can overcome any particular obstacle. We should realize that
Right.
nobody is making sure that we're going to be okay. We have to do that ourselves.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
that's interesting.
we haven't even planned major changes in humanity over the last, hundreds of thousands of years. Most changes to humanity have happened because somebody somewhere wanted it and other people couldn't stop them. People
Yeah.
introduced changes like, tanks and guns and factories and airplanes and all the things that have changed our world. We had we have just been on a train that nobody's driving. That's been the human history so far.
So then you're looking at plants like large plants, right? Uh, like in terms of when you look at like the World Economic Forum or the certain global organizations that are planning, okay, by 2030 let's have
Right.
this, let's have that, let's have lower mortalities, let's have certain things. You're thinking more like large scale. Do we
Well, those
colonize
are
Mars?
so there's an old saying that a leader is someone who figures out which way the crowd is going and gets out in front. So often our world elites play that game. They talk as if they were controlling what was going to happen, but they're more often just predicting what's going to happen and trying to get out in front and claiming to be leading. So, for example, many societies in history have also seen fertility fall, and many of them thought that was bad and made plans to stop it, and they all failed. Fertility fall has not been something societies have been able to plan to stop. Maybe we could do better, but that's certainly a warning. Most long-term trends that people don't like, they don't find a way to stop.
You would have to change like that. Having a lot of kids would be significant,
Now it would change some
right?
infrastructure, would change a lot of culture, and people might not like those cultural changes. So culture has
Yeah.
been changing rapidly, but we don't plan those changes. What we more often is have cultural activists fight. So different people and groups stand up and say, we want culture to move in this direction. And then they fight it out, and then some of them win. And the winners say, see, we planned this all along. So, for example, the most important cultural event of the 20th century was probably World War II. The start of World War II and the end were both pretty random. They had huge cultural impacts, but it's not like the world planned that event and its ending. It was pretty random.
And how do you see the world now that is happening? So the random part of it is somewhat beautiful in a way because it's just so the chances of us being here is just really, 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 really statistically so low. First, the galaxy that if
Right.
one happens every so often, and then like as a human being, and then that human being grows up
Sure.
and so it's just, like,
But I mean,
statistically so low.
it depends on the unit you look at. If you look this particular planet, and you say, what was the chance of this planet producing us? It was really small. If you just looked at the universe and you said, look, here's 1 trillion galaxies. What's the chance that advanced life will appear anywhere? You say, well, if it appears once per million, it's pretty certain to have appeared somewhere. You just don't know
Yeah.
where, right?
Yeah. Exactly.
The Grabby Aliens model says we were pretty sure to appear somewhere at some point. And the question is, how long will we last?
And then bringing it back down to like fertility and health, what are your views on some of the solutions, or from an economics perspective, some of the solutions of like the current healthcare system, or how can we help the human beings that are here prosper better than before?
So in the United States, where I am, we spend 18% of the economy on medicine, which is the world peak. No one in the world spends a larger percentage or a larger amount on medicine than we do. So we're clearly very committed to this medicine thing. But it turns out that when we do randomized experiments to give some people more medicine than others by lowering the price for them, consistently the people who get more medicine are not healthier. So at a very basic level, we're wasting most of this money that we're spending on medicine. And we've known this for a long time. So right off the bat, you see huge failures of our world to sort of listen to data and make key basic choices in response to it. We've known for a great many decades that, in fact, most of medicine, if you dropped it, it wouldn't really change health. But we're still spending enormous amounts on it. So then I can tell you how we could do better, but the main problem is to get anybody to listen. If they won't listen to this one simple fact, why would they listen to anything else I say about medicine? So I do have ideas for how we could buy medicine better in a more cost-effective manner. But if you can't even get people to listen to this simple fact that marginal medicine doesn't work on average, how are you going to get anybody to do anything? So this is a key problem as a social scientist, intellectuals I have, which is I can spend a lot of time and effort figuring out what's wrong with the world and coming up with solutions, but I can't get the world to listen. And so
Yeah.
the same for cultural drift or even Grabby Aliens. The key mystery for we intellectuals is how do you ever get anyone to listen? So sometimes the world changes policies and they point to intellectuals and say, we changed the policy that person recommended. But that doesn't mean that person caused it. Anytime any people want to make changes, they look for prestigious support for their proposal. And usually they can find it somewhere. That doesn't mean the prestigious supporter caused the change. It just means that it was helpful for the advocates to have somebody they could point to and support.
That's interesting. So you're saying, I mean, we've known that, you're right. So 18% of the whole economy is spent on these medicines. And if you took away a lot of these medicines, nothing would change, maybe marginal change. And so what are some of the ways that that 18% would be spent better?
We have other things that are waste too. So much of education is wasted spending. We also know that we spend way too many years in school from the point of view of, say, productivity and life later, or even enjoying life at the time. And we've known this for a while too, and it doesn't affect behavior much. Arguably, we waste a lot of money in other areas. For example, we've allowed our legal system to become way more complicated and expensive, so we can't actually use the legal system nearly as often. And when we do, it's much more expensive. We allowed that to change, and we haven't undone it. If we saved money on all these wastes, then we could, of course, spend money on the things we actually get value from, like spending time with family and friends and relaxing and being curious and learning things, traveling, whatever it else, or having more children.
Yeah.
That's another way we could spend money. And in fact, I could tell you specifically how we could promote having more kids through a financial mechanism. That would actually be relatively cheap. How do you get anybody to listen?
It would be incentivizing, like through incentives, you mean, or?
Yes, but a particular way to do it. So in the United States, every new child born inherits their fraction of the national debt. And that's roughly $100,000 in direct debt, but it's $300,000 to $700,000 in unfunded liabilities, things the government has promised to do that it hasn't arranged to pay for. So that means every new child is worth that much to the rest of us because they're saddled with that share of the debt. So,
whoa, I've never looked at it that way. That's crazy.
So we could afford to pay parents that much to make kids, and that amount of money would, in fact, make a lot more parents have kids. Now you have to worry if you just pay the same amount for all kids, you'll get lots more low-quality kids, not so many high-quality kids. So there's a way to do better there, a little more complicated. But the key idea is kids are worth a lot already directly to the government because they are immediately saddled with their share of the national debt.
So what's the way to the quality? What's that way? What
So
are your thoughts
what
on
I'd
that?
suggest is giving parents a transferable right to a share of their kids' future tax payments. So every time
Interesting.
in the future the kid pays taxes, part of that money will go to somebody else who bought the right to it. And now the parents can sell that right to pay for parenting expenses. And this gives
Whoa.
an incentive for children who will pay more taxes to
Right.
get more resources to create and raise them.
Wow, that's interesting. And it seems like we're gonna have to come up with something like that.
Most civilizations in the past never solved this. I can give you examples if you want. The Roman Empire had falling
Yeah.
fertility, especially among the elites. Emperor Augustus, I think in the first century, saw the problem. He tried to implement draconian policies to limit what, say, single men could do, like they couldn't go to the, games and the amphitheaters unless they got married, but it didn't work. Young men did not have more kids in response to Emperor Augustine's draconian policies. And there have been many examples like that. They just have not done enough to change. So it does seem possible, though, that is when large payments have been made for kids, it has had effects, but you have to get large payments and it's hard to get support for doing that. So I just told you this tax thing. that doesn't require any payments by the rest of us now, you see. That is,
Right.
when we have a kid, we're basically getting to pay off part of the debt by their future payments. So we can afford to borrow that if necessary. We could borrow money to pay parents because those parents' kids were going to pay debt later. So it doesn't have to come from taxpayers. But
Wow, that's so
you have to get people
interesting.
to be willing to do it. And that's the hard part.
Yeah. And to kind of wrap things up, I feel like I could talk forever, in a lot of these concepts. I know you wrote a book about the age of Elm, and so how do you, and even before, like, robotics are now making their way into our society way more than what we thought in the past, like 10 years ago, but maybe you had a different vision of it. How are you viewing this convergence of robotics into our house, into our lives? AI is a part of us now. I mean, how are you?
We've had recent advances that are impressive and welcome, but overhyped. That is, AI is not about to take over the economy. It may,
Right.
find a few more applications. We're still a long way from human level AI. Through my lifetime, I've just continually seen AI hyped in the news over and over again, and people don't seem to learn the lesson from the previous hypes not being realized. I did a academic study of all jobs in the US from 1999 to 2019, a 20-year period. And I had data on, for each job, how automated it was in each year. So I could just look at how fast things are getting automated over that period. Not very fast. I could look at the effect of automation changes on changes in wages or number of workers, and no net change. And I could look at what are the predictors of which jobs get more automated using 250 different job features. And the predictors of job automation did not change over this period. So there was basically no revolution or substantial change in the nature or rate of automation in the 20-year period from 1999 to 2019, even though there was a lot of press during that period about supposed revolutions in AI and automation.
I wonder what those numbers would be in the next, from 2019 to 2029. Since, I mean,
I mean,
so
we
much
could bet
has
on it, but
happened.
I would bet they won't change. I will bet the same trend continues, and there won't be a deviation from trend in that next 10-year period either. I do think that eventually we will get human level AI, or the topic of my first book, brain emulations, which is a certain way to get AI. That will eventually happen, and is well worth thinking about now how that will play out and how we can prepare for it. But I just don't think it's happening right now.
I just know that, like, for me, like, it has transformed the way that we work in the hospital. I mean, transformed it. Saved 3 or 4 hours a day, enhance the ability to look at the detail of the data, of massive amounts of data, and summarize them. And so it's just hard to think
But
that.
it hasn't changed your patient's mortality. If we look at the actual outcomes that matter for your business, it hasn't changed those.
That's interesting. Well, that's something to think about, and that's exciting.
So just a
What
last point I want to stick in there is, eventually we will get human level AI and or brain emulations, which are computer models of specific humans. And a key point about these things is they can be produced much faster than humans. The
Yeah.
population of AIs or brain emulations can grow much faster than the population of humans can. And because of that, they would quickly face subsistence wages. So most of human history, most humans lived at subsistence wages, a Malthusian world, because the population could grow faster than wealth and income could. That would be true for AI and brain emulations as well. They would be subsistence wages creatures, and they would therefore face a much more competitive world than we do. And that should fix cultural drift.
Like, it would fix aspects of it, right? But, like, it wouldn't fix fertility.
It would fix the AI's fertility. That's what I'm
Oh, for
saying.
sure.
They would grow much
Yeah.
faster. So their economy would have plenty of fertility. Bio-squishy human fertility wouldn't be fixed, but they would become a marginal part of the economy anyway. They are sort of retirees, aristocratic retirees, sitting off on their rural plantations, watching the new rapid economy grow elsewhere. Unfortunately, what we have as a deadline, world population is going to peak soon and then start to decline. And when that happens, innovation rates will decline. And if they decline far enough, then AI or brain emulation won't be invented until they rise again. Basically, we have roughly 70 years worth more of progress at previous rates to invent human level AI or brain emulation. And if we do, then they have a population explosion of them, which replaces the humans, and then the economy can keep growing, and that will fix cultural drift. And so we have a brave new world that goes on if we can do that in that next 70 years of.
And when you say replaces humans, like that's the one thing that you have to kind of think through. Value of humans, if you look through, you can draw the line from you to your grandpas to back, ancient years ago. And so the value of that human life in terms of the energy input that was put in to create that is massive. So you would think that it would be so valuable that somehow the technology, robots, AI, brain emulations, we could align it to cherish that and to help that flourish.
So, I mean, a key question is how much you want to other the AIs. AIs don't exist yet. So some people see AI as a competing species coming to threatening our prosperity by taking away our lunch, by outcompeting us. But they don't exist yet. They're better thought of as our descendants. They are some of our descendants. We will make them, and then they will exist, and then they will inherit many features from us. We will make them in our image. So our AIs or brain emulations will be descendants of ours. They may have conflicts with other descendants of ours, our bio-squishy descendants. And then we have to think about their sibling rivalry. But we should want to promote both kinds of descendants. And often parents, when they have a child who's much more promising, more intelligent, athletic, whatever, they often do invest more in the more promising child. They don't neglect the other child entirely, but parents do play favorites. Maybe that's okay to play favorites, to invest more in your more promising child. If that's how we want to act, honestly, the AIs and brain emulations are more promising children. So maybe it makes sense to favor them a bit compared to the bio-squishy humans. But we should still want to minimize conflict between them if we can. But I think this changes how you think about the AIs. They aren't aliens coming from another star system to compete with us. They are some of our descendants. They won't be able to compete with us until we teach them a lot more than we have about what we value and how to live and be cooperative in our society.
Yeah, I see what you're saying, but I don't know if it has settled which one would be the one, the child that would be the best, right? Because I mean,
and parents don't have to decide that, right?
Yeah, right.
Parents,
To create
if they don't know, they invest in all of their children until they can find out better which ones they might want to favor.
And that would be in terms of output or in terms of, but like a human emotion, like the technology of that is like robots. I think
the AIs will definitely have emotions, and so will the brain emulations. Emotions won't be a limiting factor. You will have to decide if you like their emotions, but they will definitely have emotions.
You think in the depth of complexity and historical context that a human being, I mean, has it?
Yes.
In the uniqueness of that.
I mean, it'll be a different uniqueness, but yes, they will be unique emotions they will have, just like humans have unique emotions. They are some of your descendants. So sometimes we have a child who's more like us, and then we have a child who's less like us. You might have been outgoing personality and one of your children is outgoing and the other child is an introvert, right?
Yeah.
And you always have to decide how much to favor the child who's like you versus the child who's different from you.
Yeah.
And it's not the only criteria that goes into deciding how much effort to put into your different children.
Definitely, this is like very interesting times to be alive right now. Well,
I mean, all this will take many decades to play out. There's no
for
particular rush
sure.
this year or next year or something, but yeah, you're in an era. So I actually have an essay from a while ago called "This is the Dream Time," where I
Oh,
say
cool.
the distant past and the distant future are in some ways more like each other than our world today. The distant past and the distant future are both pretty competitive worlds, pretty Malthusian worlds, pretty stable worlds. And we're in this rare, non-Malthusian, rapidly changing time where we are less disciplined by selection pressures, which allows us to be weird and strange in many ways. This is the dream time. This is a unique, strange time in history that in the future they will tell stories about because it was so unusual.
That is awesome. And what is your future work? What is in terms of your future projects? What will you be spending your time?
I've
Immerse
only been
yourself.
working on cultural drift here for like 5 or 6 months, so presumably continue that for at least a few months. In parallel, I have been pursuing my prediction market concepts, my ways to reform governance through betting markets and other institution ideas. And so those are actually coming to fruition more. So I started writing about prediction markets 34 years ago. 9 years later, I started to see how it made more sense to think about what I call decision markets, where it's decision conditional advice that the markets give. And I invented a form of governance based on that I call futarchy. And that was 25 years ago. And only in the last year, people started to try it. I'm starting to see some experiments in the field trying out my new governance concept.
Does the blockchain or Bitcoin or these new financial models facilitate it?
Well,
And
some of the
what you
experiments are being done on the blockchain, Solano blockchain in particular. There are experiments in the futarchy governance on that blockchain. Yes, the blockchain helps there because I guess it lets people more evade legal restrictions and sort of set up their governance in that way, but it's not necessary. Mostly it's just that people hadn't been willing to try it. So like I told you before, it's relatively easy to come up with ways to improve the world. The hard thing is to get anyone to listen. And sometimes you just have to wait and keep talking. And eventually, randomly, people start listening.
And the futarchy, what is it?
It's vote on values, but bet on beliefs. The idea is so for example, we could have a futarchy for a for-profit company, and we could decide whether to fire the CEO or not by comparing two conditional stock prices. We have the price of the company conditional on the CEO staying, and we have the price of the company conditional on the CEO leaving. If the market price says that the company is worth more when the CEO leaves, then you should fire them. And if the price says the company is worth more if the CEO stays, then you should keep them. So that's a way of using speculative markets to advise key governance choices, like whether to keep a CEO or whether to fire the CEO. And that's just an example of how this governance mechanism could be used for a great many governance decisions in a great many kinds of organizations. What you need is discrete choices that you will make one way or another, and then an outcome measure like the stock price. That's the metric for whether it was a good decision.
Right. Wow. And that's kind of brutal, but very effective in a way, probably, huh?
Right. Market speculators have no peer in general when it comes to making reliable estimates robustly about the consequences of actions or anything else. We have a lot of data comparing speculative markets to parallel mechanisms. The usual result is either the market estimators do substantially better or about the same as other ways to estimate various outcomes. So that means they can resist manipulation and biases much better because you give people an incentive to search for the biases or the manipulators and counter them.
Oh, that's great. Oh, I'd love to hear more about that, but I know we're coming up here on time. If somebody wants to hear more about the futarchy or it's called futarchy,
Yes,
right?
right, exactly.
Futarchy. Where would they go?
Well, obviously,
In
if
the
you
rest
just
of the
search
world?
for my name online, Robin Hanson, you will find
Yeah.
stuff. You'll search for the word futarchy, you will find stuff about that. If you search for Grabby Aliens, you will find a website about that. If you search for my name in cultural drift, you'll find my writings about that and some talks and
That's
talks on all
amazing.
these things. So I'm relatively easy to find.
That's the beauty of economics, because you can literally, I mean, we've talked about physics, astrophysics, healthcare. And so it's incentives and direction and actions. And so it's like you
Right.
could play that in any field. It's so awesome.
It took me a while to decide what field to specialize in. And I chose economics in part because there were so many things you could do and call it economics. But then once I got tenure in economics, I did not stay in that lane even and just did other things that you really wouldn't call economics. So by this point, I'm not so much an economist as just a general scholar.
Yeah.
Looks for important neglected topics and tries to take them on as best I can. I'm more of a polymath.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure talking to you. And definitely would love to chat with you again in the future, see how the work of futurkey and follow up in that and how that's going.
All right. Well, let's find out how many people like and watch this one.
All right. Take care.